One of the main things I hear is that people think it's defiance. If we misunderstand it, then we can make it worse. So if you remember that when the child feels safe, there's more chance of speech. So your behaviour is the intervention. There's some misconceptions about selective mutism. One of the main things I hear is that people think it's defiance, that they're doing it on purpose and that they can control it and that they just are doing it to be rude and sort of doing it just as a choice, basically, that they choosing when to speak or when not to speak, because sometimes they might hear them speak or they might hear them talking when they're playing a game or whatever the situation is. So if they've heard them, then, or they used to speak and now they don't speak, they think it can be control, rudeness, or something along those lines. However, it is not because of that. It's a severe anxiety response, or like you could view it as a performance anxiety response to a social situation. If we misunderstand it, then we can make it worse. So if we go from the point of view that they're doing it on purpose, they're trying to control a situation, they're just refusing to speak, then we can do a lot of things to make it more difficult for that person, which I'll go through lots of the difficulties that we can cause if we don't understand it fully. The psychology behind selective mutism is that there's a freeze response. So you'll have heard about the fight, flight, or freeze, where this is the freeze response bit that we need to focus on the most. So they'll perceive some kind of threat, which is the social situation. It could be performing, and it could be just that they've got the pressure of trying to speak. So typically what happens is there'll be a spike in anxiety, which is where they see it as a threat. And so once they see the threat, then they freeze. And so then the child can't speak. They then get a response from adults, and it's typically that adults will put pressure on them to speak. So they might say different things, which causes a lot of pressure for the child to then speak. That then increases anxiety even more, and as it increases anxiety even more, the freeze then deepens, and so then they get stuck in the freeze even more. So their limbic system gets activated. That's the fight or flight aspect, where they'll then get lots of different chemicals going on in the body over the situation that they perceive as a big threat. If the adults then put lots of pressure on and keep that cycle going, then it just repeats and it just keeps that kind of frozen state happening, which then it means that the child may be perceived by the adult as being awkward, but they're not being awkward. So the key message from this is that the child is not being awkward. It's a freeze response. They have perceived a threat and their body and brain is reacting in that way. So they don't need more pressure. The environment plays a huge role within this whole pattern. So it's not about that the child won't talk to adults. It's about they're in an environment where adults will make the child feel observed, evaluated, or unsafe. And so another word is they may feel that they're being criticized. And so adults can then accidentally reinforce silence by showing lots of attention. So if they are trying to give the child lots of attention to encourage them to speak, that can then reinforce the silence or the selective mutism. But also expectations, and if there is any element of embarrassment to try and get them to speak. And so even with expectations to speak, any expectations creates a lot of pressure, and it creates it's like a huge demand to then speak. So there's some things that you need to keep in mind and reflect and evaluate. What do you do, or what could you do to contribute to that silence? Are you showing any expectations or any giving them attention or having any aspect where they're feeling evaluated, like they're being critiqued? And if you are, then we need to reflect on it and think about how can you do it differently. We might wonder why this is even a factor, but if you think about the opposite, so if the child is in an environment where they feel really safe and then they're not being evaluated, there's no pressure, then they have more chance of speaking because the anxiety will drop, the freeze response won't be there, and so they'll have more chance of speaking. What not to do. There is a list of things that are definitely good to not do. So some of them is where you would put the child on the spot. You might even ask them to use their own words or to encourage them to speak and say, come on, you can just use yes or no, or you try and then overcompensate for them. And also, even when you would speak for them, and when you speak for them consistently, that then can sabotage things as well. If you ask questions in public, that can put a lot of pressure on them. And again, it's like a huge demand that you've now done it in a public setting. And if they don't speak, then it can increase that embarrassment that they'll feel, which reinforces the negative aspects and increases the anxiety. If you praise speech too much, that can create an atmosphere where they'll be a lot more self-conscious because there's a lot more attention being drawn to what could be perceived as good speech or improved speech, and so that again it creates a lot of pressure, and then there's that almost performance demand to speak. Evidence-based therapeutic approaches. Graded exposure is one of the best ways to deal with this. And so graded exposure is where you start in small steps and you would focus on very small ways to increase the exposure to speaking. Now, this isn't just jumping from 0 to 10 and asking them to speak and trying to encourage them to use their words. It's a very small, gradual process. So if you view it as if someone was scared of spiders and you were trying to help them overcome that and using graded exposure, you wouldn't just chuck a tarantula on them because they'd feel out of control. Their perception of threat would be huge and they would reinforce the fears. So what we would do is we would look at is discussing spiders, does that make the anxiety spike too much? Does looking at pictures, videos, you would look at it and try and scale about the things that are the most anxiety provoking to the least anxiety provoking. And so when you do that, you'll find out what the smaller steps are. And so then you would gradually introduce those smaller steps. So with spiders, you would then say talking about spiders was tolerable to a degree because it has to increase some level of anxiety. So then if that was the case, then that's what you would focus on. So you would talk about spiders. Then when that doesn't produce a response that brings anxiety, then you would move up to the scale to the next thing. So let's say it was pictures of spiders. Then we would then go through the process with that. And each time you evaluate and look at, did that give you a big anxiety response? Or did you get to the point where there was no anxiety when you got repeated exposure to it? And as they evaluate that, it then helps them modify their beliefs, which helps them change their perception of the threat. So if we're thinking about a spider, it would help you not be as scared of that. So we keep raising the scale to eventually when you would be able to touch a spider or be in the same room as a spider. So it's a graded exposure to help desensitize and reduce the anxiety response. Graded exposure in regards to selective mutism can be when you would look at the different things, methods of communication, and which ones increase anxiety, and could there be some way of doing something where it will increase anxiety slightly but enough that they can tolerate it and overcome that step. So if they communicated by writing down messages, it might be that they write down the message but they'll do this in another room and then they'll come over and hand it to you. So there's more of a performance aspect and sharing of the message. That might not work for some people, and so you'd need to try and figure out what the different levels are so that you can target it at the right level, because we don't want to jump too far up. Shaping is the next part. So it's a bit like graded exposure, but it's where you'll accept their nonverbal responses first. So all the different things that they do to communicate nonverbally, you would focus on accepting that, and then you would start to look at just increasing it a little bit. So there might be whispers, so rather than just talking out loud, you might be doing little whispers to each other. But then also you could include to short speeches. So as you start to get to short speeches, that shapes it and brings it up a bit higher. So look at going from nonverbal things to short speech. Bridging is another way, and so this is where you would use a familiar person that the child trusts, who they can communicate with, and where they have then went through lots of the stages to communicate. And so then you would help the child communicate using the familiar person. And so this is a strategy to increase and improve speech, but it's not the long-term approach. Reducing the perceived threat helps massively. We can do this in lots of different ways, but with spiders, we wouldn't just take the spider out or say we're not ever going to work on spiders, because the aim is to overcome the fear of spiders if that's what we were working on. So with reducing the perceived threat for speaking, then we're going to look at making any speech routines predictable. We'd make, whether it's greetings or goodbyes or any type of communication that you're doing, you would make it very predictable. You would offer quiet spaces, you would reduce the pressure, you would reduce any expectations and any critical aspects. So you would try and monitor and regulate your facial expressions and gestures, because you wouldn't want to come across as critical. So reducing the perceived threat helps reduce limbic system activity, and that decreases the anxiety and helps the child feel safer and calmer, which is more likely to improve speech or the possibility of speech. Some other good strategies are using commenting, not questioning. So if you ask questions, that's a really quick way to make people freeze up and not speak. So it increases that anxiety and that perception of threat of the social situation, where if you comment, then there's no expectation to reply. So as long as you're comfortable and don't show any expectations of a reply, that will significantly help. You can accept gestures and head nods and pointing. And so if you're more comfortable with that as well, so as a child would head nod, gesture, point, and you accept that and are totally comfortable with it, again, keeping in mind that you show no critical aspects and that you are okay with them, that makes them feel safer, reduces that limbic system pressure and threats, which then it helps them have more chance of speaking. Keeping a calm tone can help significantly, because if we don't keep a calm tone, they'll pick up on it. So if you view them as highly sensitive, so their perception of threat, or as their limbic system is checking, is this a threat, it's really sensitive and attuned. So they'll pick up on micro expressions in your face, tone of voice, and so that's where you'll need to use warm, friendly tone of voice and be calm. And if you just check how you're feeling, so that when you enter the room to speak to them, you aren't filled with anxiety, wondering, are they going to talk? And so then that'll help them a lot as well, because it'll help you'll be modeling how to regulate your emotions and how to have a social interaction. And so you can even model that by not necessarily talking direct to the person, to the child, but you can model how some of the responses could be. And especially if there's two adults around or another child, you can talk and kind of slowly try to model some good, healthy ways to communicate. But you can also speak and kind of reply to yourself, but do it in a way where there's no expectation, where you're not expecting a response from the child. So you might say, oh, I wonder what's for tea tonight. Oh, I'm quite hungry, so I think I'm going to eat a lot. And it might be, I'm hoping that there's mashed potato or whatever food it is that you talk about. But you can kind of use the question answer thing, but to yourself. Because earlier I've already said, comment, not using questions to them, but you can model social interactions by talking to yourself out loud and saying what you're doing. So you could be putting away clothes, you could be doing whatever it is, tidying the bedroom, and you could just be commenting out loud what you're doing at that time. A key part of all of this with all the strategies is to be consistent. So if one person isn't consistent and one person puts lots of pressure on, then it's going to undo lots of the progress made by everyone else. So make sure that everyone stays consistent. If it's a school-based environment, then try and do smaller groups. One-to-one is ideal, but when there's 2 or more people, that's when it'll increase and it'll become a lot harder to get any speech. So smaller groups works better. Having alternative methods of communication helps, and being able to accept different methods of communication will help as well. In a class, don't do forced reading out loud. That will increase things significantly. Selective mutism improves slowly over time. So be consistent, because they need consistent desensitization to the social situation. Relapses can happen when there's a spike of anxiety or a change or any kind of pressure. So if they're getting lots of pressure, then there can be a relapse. Anyone working with children with selective mutism need to be patient, they need to show emotional steadiness, and they need to be very consistent. Speech comes when the nervous system feels safe. So if you remember that, when the child feels safe, there's more chance of speech coming. And so your behavior is the intervention. So as you regulate yourself and as you don't put the pressure on, you're not critical, there is no expectations, then you will see a significant reduction in the pressure and the perceived threat of that social expectation of speaking, which, as that is consistent, they'll slowly start to feel safer and calmer, which helps increase the chance of speaking.